Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. My name is Chris DeMuth. I'm a fellow here at Hudson Institute, and I direct the Hudson Initiative on Future Innovation, which is sponsoring this panel to discuss our latest publication, Organization and Innovation in Air Traffic Control. It is part of the learning of people that study innovation that new ideas are often powerfully resisted, slow to take hold, because large organizations that have developed over the decades an organizational structure, an internal culture that is built around old methods of solving problems, find it difficult to adapt. The organizations have adapted to the technology, and when new technology comes along, it often has to find its home in new organizations. Microsoft versus IBM, Google versus Microsoft, and so forth. This presents a particular difficulty when it comes to government organization, because government organizations are not subject to the usual competitive rigors, the wave of destructive creation and so forth, and they often find themselves able to hold on to older methods for much longer times than private firms. A good deal of our research is focusing on these issues, and it finds its latest embodiment in this very fine and important monograph by Robert W. Poole, which we will be discussing here this morning. We have Bob Poole is the founder of the Reason Foundation, and he pioneered a wonderful practice of stepping aside as head of the foundation to pursue his own research, and has had a wonderful second career in the last decade and a half in working on his first love of transportation policy. He's the author of numerous books and studies. He's been a consultant on these issues to virtually every national administration and the heads of large state governments in the modern era. He's the author of 3 wonderful monthly newsletters, one on surface transportation innovations, one on airport security, and one on the subject of today's study, air traffic control. He's going to give a thorough presentation of his research and give us some sense of where he thinks the prospects are for the reforms that he has put together, which reflect many long-time ideas of his and aviation experts, but have been developed in close consultation with leaders throughout the aviation community and some in government over the past several months. He will be followed by 2 expert commenters, and we're really very lucky to have gotten not just advice as the project went along, but got to appear with us this morning. First, Craig Fuller, who is currently chairman of the Fuller Company, a consulting firm for businesses and other organizations. He held senior positions at the White House in the administration of Ronald Reagan, and subsequently has held a number of positions in corporations, in public affairs, and in trade associations. Most pertinently, he is himself a lifelong flyer and was president and CEO of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association until just a few months ago. Following Craig, we will hear from Stephen Van Beek, who is Executive Director of Policy and Strategy for Lee Fisher. He has a long career in aviation planning and transportation issues. He has been a Associate Deputy Secretary of U.S. Department of Transportation, head of its Office of Intermodalism. He just completed 2 weeks ago a term as a member of the Federal Aviation Administration's Management Advisory Committee, so now he is free to tell the rest of us what he really thinks. I'm going to call upon Bob to give his presentation, followed by Craig and Steve immediately without further interruptions. We will then have some conversation among the panelists and then move to questions and a general discussion. Thank you very much. Bob, the podium is yours.
Thanks very much, Steve. Well, good. We have the thing up on the screen. This was a fascinating project to take on. I've been researching air traffic control over a period of about 30 years, starting with the controller strike in 1981, reading numerous GAO reports and Inspector General reports over the years. But for this project, I had to go deeper and do some additional original research. Chris already explained the context of the paper, so I won't bother you with that, and let's get just right into it. What's been going on in this country for the last decade is attempts to really get into a transformation of how we do air traffic control, really changing into air traffic management by relying on newer technologies and procedures that are possible with newer technologies, such as greater use of GPS for knowing where planes are exactly, both in the air and on landing, digital communications instead of complete reliance on voice, changes in facilities, and much greater use of widely shared information so everybody has all the same information at the same time. The same sorts of changes are going on in other countries. This is, the aviation is a global community, so what we're doing here is hardly unique. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in Australia, and Canada, and so forth. NextGen is the name of it in the United States, and began with a joint organization called the JPDO, multi-agency, but the main part of it is certainly air traffic management, and so the main responsibility has fallen to the FAA to try to develop and implement it. Lots of problems have emerged in the decade that we've had so far. There's a big problem of proper timing, because all this stuff needs new equipment on planes that airlines and business jets have to buy and install, but they have huge uncertainty as when is FAA going to have its act together to enable the use of that equipment. And so coordinating all that when you have the FAA that has continual ups and downs and budget uncertainty, can't plan in a reliable, believable fashion for what's going to happen for sure 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, makes a big problem. The funding problem has always been a problem, but it's gotten much worse in the last 2 years with the budget problems that we all know, partial shutdowns of the government, of FAA, layoffs, furloughs of controllers, and so forth. And there's the continuing problem of the FAA's risk-averse, slow-moving bureaucratic culture that has been, the GAO reports that I read today about procurement problems and others are virtually the same in substance, although the specifics are different, as I was reading in the 1980s and the 1990s. Despite procurement reform, personnel reform, and so forth, those problems seem to be still there in a very serious manner. We have an organization, RTCA, that has done terrific work of bringing together the stakeholder customers to advise the FAA on setting priorities for NextGen, which has helped, definitely, and it's proven to people something that people thought was impossible, that all of these aviation stakeholders who often fight each other and lobby cross purposes in Congress have been able in the last 3 or 4 years to work together and find consensus on what the priorities should be. That's a very encouraging sign, but they're still only advisory. They're not the ones making the decisions, and the FAA can't even make its own decisions. So we'll get into that a little bit more. In parallel with these efforts to transform the how of air traffic control, there's been a trend going on globally for about 25 years now, ever since New Zealand in 1987 corporatized its air traffic control system. And what this has meant in country after country has been separating the provider of the air traffic services from the government transport agency, like our FAA, and basically making it some kind of a corporate, usually a government corporation, in the case of Canada, a non-profit private corporation, but giving it the responsibility to operate more or less as a business, and it varies from country to country, with the safety regulations staying in government at arm's length from the provider. And this model has been studied. There's now over 50 countries that have done this, and these are all self-supporting from fees and charges, with a revenue stream that is pretty reliably predictable because air travel is a growing business with just minor fluctuations. They're able to issue revenue bonds for modernization. They basically have a real capital budget and a capital plan, so that people who have to decide when to buy equipment for their planes can have a much greater confidence level. This has worked quite well, and there's been book-length studies of the performance before and after of these entities, and they've worked pretty well. So that's just what to keep in mind as we go through this. So what I did in the paper is to look at 7 specific case studies that I think illustrate the problems, and then try to draw lessons from them for why do these problems occur, and then suggest, well, if these are the problems, what reforms specifically would address them, and then look at, is this a pipe dream, or is it seriously possible that we could do this? So I'm not going to go into these in detail, they're in the paper, but I'll just mention each one very briefly. Digital communication seems like a no-brainer. This actually was developed in Pacific oceanic airspace in the 1990s, basically by airframe manufacturers and airlines. They made it work, and FAA accepted it for the U.S. Pacific oceanic airspace. It actually took them another decade to get a system, which they started with the system that they bought from, I think it was from Airways New Zealand, but then it had to be customized, and that process took forever, but it's finally operational in the Oakland center that controls planes as they cross our part of the Pacific. But then, to get it into domestic airspace, FAA started a program about 10 or 12 years ago in Miami Center, and American Airlines became the lead customer. They bought equipment, put it in their planes, and the idea was that as soon as that was accepted and shown to work, they'd roll it out across all the centers across the country, and we'd have digital communication. Well, turns out they didn't figure the cost right, and so it was causing FAA budget problems, and all of a sudden they pulled the plug. Not only on that Miami startup, with American already having put equipment in a bunch of planes, but pulled the plug for further rolling it out across the rest of the country. And it sat just off on the shelf somewhere for 7 or 8 years before it's finally been restarted last year as a new, now it's called Digicom or something, Datacom. But American moved those planes to Europe to use them elsewhere where they could actually use it, the equipment. Meanwhile, Europe has set much sooner implementation deadlines. They're planning Europe-wide usage by 2015. Canada already has it nationwide and across the North Atlantic, and people who fly are getting benefits from using it. The FAA has now has a few pilot installations for control towers, and the next phase, over the next 2 or 3 years, they'll roll it out to control towers, but just for the pre-flight briefing and authorization flight plan changes. It won't be in centers across the country of high altitude airspace for another 7 or 8 years, and they're looking at maybe 2024 by having in this country what Canada has today and what Europe will have in 1 more year. So I won't go into as much detail as the others. Second one was replacing the 1930s era instrument landing systems with a GPS-based landing system that's called GBAS. This is something the private sector began the development. FAA took it over to have a project to develop it. The Inspector General wrote a critical report, said it's behind schedule and over budget. So FAA pulled the plug. Private sector said, well, we think this is really going to be viable. They took it to the corporatized provider in Australia, which worked with them and developed it and got it certified for use at Sydney. It's now certified for use at Frankfurt in Germany, and The FAA finally accepted it for the United States. United Airlines really likes it and wants to have it, and so it's installed at Newark, it's installed at their hub at Houston, but it's not part of an FAA program now. And so you only can have it at an airport if the airport or the airline serving that airport and the airport pay for it, and the FAA will say, okay, you can use it. It's very, very strange this, just to give you an idea of why is this better, one GPAS unit using augmented GPS signals can provide instrument landing systems for all the runways within a, 10 or 15 mile geographical area. So if an airport has 3 runways with each one has 2 ends, that's 6 possible runway ends. You need 6 ILSs to do that if you want to have them all with the instrument equipment. One GPAS does it. It's cheaper to maintain. So certainly, at least as ILSs wear out, they ought to be replaced with GBAS, but not so far in this country. I think Europe, it's a key part of the modernization in Europe, so we'll see. GPS for surveillance, big FAA program called ADSB that uses GPS for this and is a potential. So originally the intent was this would replace radar for keeping track of where planes are. Well, that has gotten gradually scaled back and scaled back. The business case was that the system would save a whole lot of money by not having to replace the old radars as they wear out, but we use this instead. Well, 9/11 led to the DoD saying, well, you're not going to get rid of primary radars because planes try to sneak in without a transponder on or without ADSB. We've got to be able to see them. And with ADSB, it's a cooperative type of system. They have to have it operating and turned on in order for you to know where their position is. Then the newer problem, GPS vulnerability came along, and because the U.S. government has failed to implement a solution as a backup system for all uses of GPS, FAA is having to try to concoct a bits and pieces solution on its own, which involves keeping all the secondary radars, which is the one that interrogate transponders, and half of the really old VORs, the fixed position signals that pilots have used for decades and decades for navigation. So almost all of the ground equipment that was originally supposed to be scrapped to make the business case for cost savings for domestic ADSB is now going to be kept anyway. The strongest, the most obvious case where you really need ADSB is over oceanic space, places where you can't have radar because there's no place to mount it, across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, in polar regions where there's nobody there to service the equipment and so forth. And so a company comes along a few years ago, Iridium, which has a 66 satellite constellation, says, hey, we can see a business operation to provide global ADSB coverage everywhere, especially these places where you can't have radar. They approach FAA and say, hey, would you like to be a partner in this, put a little money in and be the launch customer? And he says, this looks promising, but. And they fussed around for about a year and couldn't reach a decision and certainly couldn't get to yes on either investing or being a launch customer, given procurement regulations and budget problems and so forth. So they said no, so Iridium went to Nav Canada, a corporatized nonprofit provider of air traffic in Canada. They said, yes, where do we sign? A simple business decision. They are now a 50% owner of the company, which is called Aerion, and 3 more air navigation service providers, all corporatized in Europe, have signed on as also part owners and launch customers as well. And FAA will eventually sign a deal to use, we hope, to use the service. But this is an awful example of the risk-averse nature, status quo nature of FAA. I see the time is going by faster than so we're going to go a little faster on the other case studies. PBN, performance-based navigation, is something that, again, is using newer technology to provide more precise navigation, and including, one of the big payoffs is short, curved approaches into airports that can minimize noise exposure on the ground, reduce the amount of fuel burned on approach and landing, and so forth. Southwest Airlines believed FAA this was going to be a big deal thing. They outfitted their whole fleet a couple of years ago for RMP, and there's only a handful of places 2 years later where they can actually use it because of FAA being very, very slow of rolling this out at airports. So it's just, and there's more stories in the paper, but I don't have the time to go into it. This is one of my favorite, real-time weather data. Weather at high altitudes today, the U.S. Weather Service launches weather balloons, I think from something like 60 locations twice a day, 12-hour apart, to provide information on what's going on up there at 50,000 feet. And that feeds into weather models that then lead to weather forecasts for different parts of the high altitude airspace. Well, that's pretty old-fashioned technology. A little company that FAA actually gave some seed money to created a thing called CAMDAR, which puts sensing devices on planes that report in real time all kinds of weather information, more than is reported by weather balloons, including icing, real-time icing conditions, very, very important to know. And they created three-dimensional and four-dimensional, i.e. time-dependent weather models that are significantly more accurate than the National Weather Service's models. Over 300 planes have this equipment installed and operating, providing real-time data. FAA, meanwhile, Next-Gen Weather is the name of a program or programs that's supposed to be part of Next-Gen. We still haven't seen a procurement for anything. And this is out there. There's actually a couple of other companies that are providing things with gadgets on planes that report back in real time. American Airlines has equipped its whole fleet with something that reports turbulence on a real-time basis. And that is very, very useful for warning planes that they be following one of their planes, that there's turbulence here and you need to know it now. Again, just a tragic case of missing opportunities to innovate. Remote towers, it is certainly possible to provide the same kind of awareness of what's going on at an airport with video cameras and various other sensing devices. And the two immediate most important applications are low-activity airports. For example, the airports where there were sleeping controllers, there was only one, and would require that there be two. But even though most of those airports don't meet FAA criteria for having enough activity at night to be staffed at night in those towers, but if you have 3 or 4 of those low-activity towers managed from one location using camera and other data, then a small crew, there'd be enough activity for 2 controllers to be on duty on the midnight shift there. So that's one application. It would save a lot of money in staff time. The other is huge airports like O'Hare. O'Hare now, they're doing this major runway expansion project. They now have 2 control towers because the rule is the controllers in a tower are supposed to be able to see all of each runway. Well, this is so spread out now that they can't see all of the runways. But as they go to the last phase, they won't be able to see even with the 2 towers, so they're either underway or it's definitely in the plans to build a 3rd tower at O'Hare. Now, this is just nonsense. I mean, any organization paid by its customers to do high value, get the most bang for the buck would not do this. But building towers is what FAA does, so that's what they're doing. Meanwhile, remote towers are this year being certified in Norway and Sweden. Projects are underway in Germany and Australia. The commercialized providers see the point of this and are going ahead and do it. Facility consolidation, Gary Church in the audience here was helped with a major recent, he was the main author, a major recent study on consolidating facilities that we published last year. And there are definitely economies. We've definitely demonstrated there's economies of scale. The busiest centers and TRACONs handle about twice as much activity per year per controller as the less busy ones, so there's clearly economies of scale. Also, many of these facilities are very old, costly to maintain. If we don't consolidate facilities, they're all going to have to be rebuilt at huge cost in their present locations. So there's a huge opportunity with NextGen because of all this real-time information that everybody has to consolidate, have a much smaller number of facilities and do them. And the commercialized providers are doing this in their countries. Australia, Germany, UK have all consolidated facilities. But It's not happening. There's no plan, even though Congress mandated a plan, there's no overall plan for facility consolidation yet. They mandated it in the last reauthorization over 2 years ago. Don't have a plan. So some common themes in all this. A lot of innovations, some of these innovations actually have originated in FAA research labs, but many of them originate in the private sector. But wherever they originate, FAA is very slow to grab hold of them and see what they can do and actually make them happen. Often FAA comes up with a vague requirement for some new capability, but doesn't define it in any detail. So they turn it over to contractors to do, and contractors just love to invent all kinds of things this new gadget can do, bells and whistles, engineers call them. So they get bigger and more complex, and they take longer to do, and the budget goes up. And this is a phenomenon called requirements creep that I learned about from somebody at Air Services Australia. And he says, that's not how we do it. We define rigorously what we need. We say, okay, this is it. Now, who can build it for us at the lowest price? And they don't let contractors define what they're doing. Especially FAA resists disruptive innovations like GBAS, the TAMDAR weather and remote towers. And in many cases, the way FAA has done business cases may be changing thanks to the Next Gen Advisory Group, but historically, their business case has looked at, are there cost savings for us, the FAA? Not, is there a major case of cost savings for the customers who are using planes in the system? So those are what I identify as common themes. And so I put forward 5 hypotheses as to why this happens. Because it's all one organization that historically is a safety agency, that may lead to the hyper-cautious culture, as opposed to the culture at Boeing, the culture at Honeywell, etc. They're all regulated by the FAA. Anything they produce for air traffic has to be certified by FAA before it can go to use. But because they're not self-identified as a safety provider, they think outside boxes. They're willing to try new things, knowing that it'll never be used unless it can pass FAA safety regulatory muster. So that's one hypothesis. Another is that they don't seem to have the quality of technical expertise that you see in NAV Canada, in DFS in Germany, and so forth. Program management, they clearly don't have top-flight program management expertise, or we wouldn't have 30 years of GAO and Inspector General reports constantly faulting them for bad procurements. Another problem that's been controversial in some people's view, but I think is very, very real, is there's too many people with oversight of FAA that keeps the top management always trying to respond to GAO reports, Inspector General reports, OMB, the Secretary's Office, and numerous congressional committees that always can say, do this, don't do that, why are you doing this? And that's not a very good business model for a high-performance agency or entity. Much better is to have accountability to customers and have them be responsible for saying, this is what we want, and this is what we don't want, and you're off base here, etc. Now, those hypotheses, I put forward as hypotheses, and Krista Muth organized this very extensive peer review of the draft of the report, and then culminating in a half-day workshop here, I think in this room, I think it was, Chris, with a lot of experts and a few of the people who are in the room today. And the conclusion of that was, yeah, these are more than hypotheses. These really are real things, and they deserve to be called findings rather than hypotheses. So that's how they appear in the report now as findings. So remedies, we're now almost to the end of the story. First of all, to change that safety culture that's so conservative and resistant to change, separate the air traffic organization like 50 other countries have done, make it at arm's length from the regulatory function, and give it the ability, and also exempt it from civil service, so that they can hold people accountable like any private company does, and attract the best technical talent, the best program management talent, pay them market compensation, even be able to pay them bonuses for superior performance, and let them go if they don't perform. Secondly is to get rid of the budget uncertainty and shift from taxes, user taxes admittedly, but taxes that go to the Treasury and then have to be appropriated on an annual basis. That is no way to run a capital program at all. And what the others providers have done, because they're self-supporting from their customer revenues, just like an electric utility or an airport for that matter, they're able to issue revenue bonds, like every airport in the country does, for capital investments. And this is a far superior way to do something like NextGen that involves potentially 20 billion or so of capital expenses. Third, change the governance model from this oversight by any number of outside bodies to a real board of directors that represents the whole aviation stakeholder community, including the employees, and have them function as a board of directors, hiring and firing the CEO, setting the overall policy, deciding on what the fees and charges should be in a way like the NextGen Advisory Committee that reaches a consensus among the stakeholders that everybody can live with, and have that be the governance model with arm's length safety regulation continuing from the FAA. So the question is, these things are not completely radical, even in the United States. The National Airport and Dulles Airport were divested from they were line items in the FAA budget, annual appropriations, no revenue bonds. They had user fees, they had landing fees and revenue, but they turned them all over to the US Treasury. They could only get any money back if Congress appropriated money in the FAA budget. Of course, they were a fairly small item in the FAA budget. So we did that, and it has worked. Shifting from taxes to service charge and bonding, well, as I said, that's how airports are funded. It's not a brand new model, and it's, of course, how other 50 ANSPs around the world are funded. And the governance by a stakeholder board, we have two examples of that, quite different, but NAV Canada and NATS in the UK both have boards of stakeholders. NAV Canada, I think, is better, and I like the non-profit model better than the UK for-profit model. But these things are out there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We need to tailor the ideas to our circumstances. And, this is not a brand new idea either. In the United States, there's this whole string of previous studies, even a legislative proposal under the Clinton administration, and yet we don't really. The only one thing the Mineta Commission report did lead eventually, 4 or 5 years later, to creating the ATO, drawing together the capital and operation functions of air traffic control within FAA, but the idea that it would run like a business has been falsified by experience, and it's now just finished. The third executive in charge, Dave Griswold, who's now retired and left, I don't think any of them thinks it's been a success as what the intent was to have it run like a business. There have been studies of the air navigation service providers overseas. They've all come out positive. They said things are better after the change than before. Book length study, very, very well done. So, is this a pipe dream, or is this something that could actually be done? Previous efforts, I think, I was involved, writing about, studying, agonized by the failures of all these previous ones. In almost every case, the aviation stakeholders were not on the same page. You had one case, you had the legacy airlines versus the low-cost carriers. In most of them, you've had general aviation, private planes versus airlines. You've had the controllers unions. Sometimes they actually supported the Clinton administration's corporate effort, but other times during the George W. Bush administration, they were adamantly, viciously opposed. And there was Congressman Oberstar, who for many years was a key player in transportation aviation, adamantly opposed to this and would never let anything get through this committee. All that's changed. Today, first of all, we have a widespread appreciation for the seriousness of the budget crisis and the fact that there's not really any expectation this is going to get significantly better in the next decade. General aviation groups, as Craig can tell us, understand that NAV Canada has not charged fees so high that private pilots can't fly. It's been a very good experience for private pilots in Canada and even for business jets. Aviation stakeholders, as I said before, are working to develop consensus on NextGen through the NextGen Advisory Committee of RTCA. The business community, the Chamber, and NAM, and Business Roundtable are all interested in this issue and see that there's a big problem that needs to be solved if we're going to have healthy aviation. And Chairman Schuster and Aviation Committee Chair Lobiando have both said they really see a need for big change and they want bold proposals. So I think we have a situation today where this is not a pipe dream, this actually is a conceivable effort, and I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you, Bob. And now for Craig Fuller, and let me mention the more complete biographies of all of our participants are available in the handouts. Craig?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, the Hudson Institute, for organizing this. I think this is an extremely important topic. Thank you for your generous introduction, Bob. Thank you for presenting your paper. Bob, as he was talking about weather balloons, gave me a sort of introduction because I was reflecting, Bob, that so many times I've heard phrases from controllers like, you can expect turbulence, there's a plane ahead 20 miles, you can expect turbulence until you reach 27,000 feet. I've never heard them say the last time the hot air balloon went by. But I've never been referred to as a gadget in a plane that reports the weather, but maybe that's the basis on which I'm speaking today. I come to you really as now unaligned with any particular organization, so what I want to talk about really are my perceptions. But I start with a personal story because as I was going into AOPA back in 2008, I was getting briefed regularly, as Melissa knows, who is here with us today. I was getting briefed regularly on this history that Bob talked about, and some of the challenges that the aviation community faced within its own community and from outside the community. I've been around Washington maybe too long, but I've been around long enough to know that it's very important to have your case grounded in rather rigorous research, ideally academic, high academic standards of work that's been done. And I thought, with no disrespect to my colleagues who've been working in this, but I thought that in some areas our grounding was substantively just weak. In other areas we would make points that would begin with, well, for the last 50 years this is the way we've done it. And usually anybody that begins with the last 50 years is, off by decades in terms of what need to be given in a modern time. So I called a person I'd known for some time who actually runs an economics department at a California university, and I said that I really thought that one of the things we needed to do was get much more rigorous academic background for some of the positions and the policies we were confronting. And what I was hoping to find was the single best person in the country who could do this kind of work for us. And that person said, well, there's actually one individual who's spent a lot of time with this, and the best person is Bob Poole. I said, who's the second best person? Because I had been cautioned that Bob and the general aviation community might not be aligned, which in my case caused me to get more curious about what Bob was up to and what he was writing about. And a wonderful and very productive, wonderful for me at least, but I'm hopeful for him too, a very good relationship with Bob. Not because we started it by being in fierce agreement on everything, but because we could at least take apart some of the issues from a more analytical place. And I really became convinced that we didn't really have a choice, that we were going to transition from where we had been for a long time in their traffic control management to something else. We had to make that transition, and the question was how to go about it. Now, we were also making some transitions inside this big membership organization, and we had somebody come to us one day and say, in a presentation to the leadership team, when you go through a transition, you need to think about the three states that people are always in, and he drew three concentric circles on the wall, and in the center he said, this is the comfort zone. And he said lots of people, most people like to be in the comfort zone. One ring out is the learning zone, and past that ring is the panic zone. And he said, you're always in one of those three states. It's pretty good analysis. One of the big differences among people is that some never want to get out of the comfort zone. Some actually like being in the learning zone, and even occasionally drift into the panic zone from time to time. But people operate very differently. I bring that back to the issue at hand, and from a pilot's perspective, by thinking back to the mid-1980s. And I won't exceed my time, Mr. Chairman, but in the mid-1980s, a much younger Demuth and a guy named Fuller were in the White House when the President Reagan, decided that it made good sense to make available something called global positioning satellite. Something that the Defense Department had. I can assure you, as Chris can, it set some of those people in the defense community who developed it right into the panic zone, and said we're going to turn this over to civilians. They actually had to degrade the signal so that we wouldn't go, blow up a bridge somewhere. Fortunately, none of that really happened. But that really changed everything. And interestingly enough, in one of our very fine, it was very fine then, it's very fine today, avionics manufacturing companies, there were two guys, one was named Min and one was named Gary, who recognized this changed everything and said they didn't think aircraft in the future would actually navigate point to point to these VOR ground stations. And the company said, oh, no. We've invested too much. What, the satellite thing, how would it maybe, what if it doesn't breaks down or whatever? And they couldn't get anywhere inside the company, so these two guys, Gary and Min, set up their own company in 1989. Gary and Min, probably guessed. The company they formed, they called ProgramDriven. And in 1989, and I'm using this, Bob, because it always gives me hope that actually speed is possible in aviation. In 1989, these guys set the company up. By the early 90s, I was carrying a handheld GPS device into the airplane I owned to navigate. Now, the airplane I owned didn't have a whole lot of technology in it. It had to be a dual VOR system. That was in the early 90s. 10 years later, the single-end piston aircraft I bought had dual grounding units with moving maps. And just a few years after that, the G1000 product and other manufacturers are producing products that provide pilots of single-engine aircraft with incredibly sophisticated technology. And that technology today is now in most sophisticated private jets. My point is, it moved very rapidly. But it moved not because of a government committee. It moved because people in the private sector became very engaged in finding a way to bring better technology into the aviation. And it really succeeded because I think they addressed some important questions which I do think apply to air traffic control management. And the questions in my mind when I get into this topic are we pursuing the best means to manage aircraft safely in our national airspace? I think the FAA is absolutely right. This is their absolute first and most fundamental responsibility, because if we're not operating safely in the airspace, we will get shut down. And I think we have an incredibly good system. I think I still fly 200-300 hours a year in my own aircraft. I am constantly amazed by the quality of the service we get and by the separation we get. But the second question is, are we pursuing the best means to improve the efficiency of air traffic management? And that has been, I think initially when I looked at the issue, associated with congestion. We have congestion problems. Now some of those are ground-based, some of them are based in the air. And we still have them, and we can do better. But now we have the cost of fuel at a level where if you can reduce the cost of a trip from the Northeast to Florida by 20 minutes using better air technology, you can save an airline millions of dollars. You can save private business aircraft fleets millions of dollars. And guess what? That's happening today because of technology with JetBlue and others. So we have to ask that question, safety and efficiency. Then there's this question that I think Bob's talked about do we have the best design to finance the acquisition of the technology we need in air traffic control? I came here in 1981, as you heard. I remember in the Office of Cabinet Affairs getting a call one day from a congressman. Actually, I got a call from the White House Legislative Affairs Assistant, Petersdorf, who said, "You've got to call this congressman," which I did. And he was a Republican congressman, good supporter of the administration, furious, absolutely furious that a federal facility had been removed from his congressional district by the Department of Transportation. So I said, "Oh, give me the details, I'll check it out." Well, it was like 5 people in the FAA moving from one office building to another office building. You know, a little consolidation that was going to actually save money, which we were supposed to do, but he didn't. And I saw that happen with instrument landing systems. You won't remove it, or you will install it. So it's a real issue. But now today, we face billion-dollar acquisition needs with an appropriation process in a budget, federal budget, that it stretches one's imagination to figure out how it's going to actually play out in a consistent way or in a reliable way to fund the technology we need over the next 3, 5, 10 years. And yet the money is there, the investment capital is there if we can find ways through bonds and other mechanisms. And then in this list of 4 questions, the 4th one is how do we best execute? How do we best make this system operate? And I sometimes think we don't spend enough time on that, because this is not just a technology problem. The technology in Seattle, the technology issues in Seattle to show us how to fly arrivals over low-impact areas, over water, with greater fuel efficiency is there. But operationally, making it happen there and in other cities is a very complex operational issue inside an agency, where even when the leadership of the agency goes to Seattle and praises something, it can take months and months and months, and still, in some cases, it's not happening as it should. I think that the solutions that Bob is talking about, I know are controversial, but I have to say, and this is where he and I came together, simply believing the status quo is going to get us where we need to be is something you can no longer do. You have to think about how we're going to make a successful transition to a place where the technology and the very capable people we have in the system can work more. I do believe Bob is right. I do believe that this is a moment in time when we should all, those of us in the aviation community, should all want to step up and be a part of pushing this transition with increasing speed. I don't really think, and this is rare in Washington, I don't think that there's any element of the aviation community that needs to be positioned as the antagonist. I don't think that's speaking in a way that's naive. I think that everybody can benefit if we improve the quality of our air traffic management system. Bob is quite right. The aviation community has come together in ways that are extremely important. That is not easy. It's tested all the time as issues come into the forefront. Margaret Jennings is here from RTCA. RTCA and the Next Gen Advisory Council have worked very effectively with parties with multiple interests around the table, but with a very clear goals in sight to improve our air traffic control system, and it has worked. Congress is sometimes mentioned as a barrier, but right now I don't think Congress is the barrier. I think the leadership in Congress that focuses on aviation has sent signals both publicly and privately that they are ready for these new ideas to be explored and worked on. I do think that you can't look at where we are today, and this report is very valuable. Bob mentioned it. It has his name on it, and rightfully so, because he's done an extraordinary job. But many, many people participate in this. And if you know Bob Poole and you know the process by which he works on things, this has been an iterative process. Hudson convened this group, and the group met, but the process has taken place over many weeks with many, many comments. And so it's Bob's work. It deserves to have his name on it, but he really oversaw a process that captured many ideas. For those who contributed, I hope you recognize those ideas in here, and if they're not in here, go see Bob. And they're not all in here, but it was a process that took account of many, many different suggestions. And I think for that reason, it deserves a close look. I was talking to an executive branch official a few weeks ago, and I said, sometimes around town there's a tendency to believe that if we're going to go through this evolutionary process, we're going to have to do it and face opposition to administration. But I don't understand that because, one, we need you involved, and two, in the past you've actually, these proposals have emanated from the administration. And he cautioned, don't believe we're going to be in opposition. We're trying to figure out what the right answer is. And that gave me some encouragement. I would close by saying, and I mentioned a minute ago to the controllers, if you go sit today in an air traffic control facility, and you see the young men and women that are coming into those centers, and even the folks that have been around for a while, but men and women that are coming in, they've grown up with all this stuff. They use iPads. They can't quite believe the slowness of the pace. And every time I have spent time with these folks and I talk to them, on the airplane, I think to myself, we owe it to them. They're walking in every day committed and dedicated to what is a stressful and difficult job of keeping the American public and everybody else who flies in air systems. We owe it to them. They have the finest system, the best technology, and the best means of providing them with the tools they need. And I think in many ways, that's what this is. Thanks so much.
Greg, thanks so much. Steve?
Thank you, Christopher, and thanks to Hudson Institute for supporting what I consider to be a very good project and the work of Bob and the previous sessions that we had here. I'm going to do three things today. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think the report is significant, more maybe from an academic and applied policy point of view. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about how it is connected to today's policy context and the work actually that we've recently completed on the FAA Management Advisory Council. And let me say I'm delighted, Craig, you'll be on the next 3 years of that group. And third, I'd like to suggest to Bob and others in this room who I know work on these matters as well, a next set of questions given what you've done today, Bob, with this report. So let me start with the report's significance. I do think it makes a significant contribution to understanding why today's FAA is not the best answer for how we deliver air traffic services and how we are going to plan and implement the variety of technologies, procedures that underlie NextGen, that is a modernized air traffic control system in the United States. In his typically excellent fashion, Bob has taken 7 case studies that you saw just a little bit about, but I really do commend all of them to you in some detail, and translated very complicated technical data and into a very understandable, crisp report. A lot of these things that you read can be very difficult to get through, and I found this one actually remarkably easy to get through in comparison to some others, and that's just good writing, and I appreciate that. Now, these 7 case studies detail problems. They have sort of 3 or 4 themes that I've seen. Number one is the FAA's problem in defining requirements for the system, and that's shifting over a period of time. Secondly, notwithstanding some reforms that have been passed, their difficulty in procuring new technology and adapting that within their current system. And thirdly, and I think this is a very interesting point, Bob, the problem with adopting high potential innovations into air traffic control that disrupt, you would say, that sort of reinforce the status quo. I would say disrupt current programs. And one of the most interesting underlying things in the report, I thought, was this relationship between program officers, contractors, and outsourcing that's already taken place at the FAA, and the fact that these folks are not mission-driven, but are very program-driven. And I think that is something, Randy Babbitt, when he came in first as FAA administrator, who was the administrator at the beginning of our service on the MAC, said, I really want to turn the FAA into more of a mission-based organization. And so I think folks see that issue. So that's very positive. Now, the FAA MAC, get to my second point, over the last 3 years, we've witnessed sequestration, continuing resolutions, lapses of FAA authority, and really an untold story in the press has been how we're really triaging the FAA these days. There's billions of deferred maintenance. We're not actually maintaining navigation aids now at many airports. We've closed the Controllers Academy periodically to save money. And so we're actually creating a bow wave of future new investments that are going to be required even as we try to do next gen, that the last few years have really caused problems with the FAA. The FAA is failing today. This is not a hypothetical issue. And I think, that is why folks like the National Air Traffic Controllers Union, who saw their members furloughed, all the controllers furloughed 1 day per pay period last year, that is why they've turned from some previous instances to become supporters, in fact, of commercializing the air traffic control system. Now, our work on the MAC said what we really need to do is find a new sustainable funding model, and that is taking the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, which 43 years ago was an ingenious invention. It was basically to say in a budget that we do with annual appropriations, and where the federal government doesn't have a capital budget, unlike the private sector, or unlike NAV Canada, the Airport and Airway Trust Fund would provide a steady, sustainable source of revenue to pay for capital investments for the airway system and for airports around the country. And it worked for many years. The problem now is financially it doesn't work for a variety of different reasons. And the supplement that we've had from the general fund during many of those years to help provide that steady state budget to the FAA is no longer as reliably there as it used to be. But what I think Bob's paper reinforces the point that even if we were to design a new trust fund or a sustainable funding model, we would not realize its full benefits without organizational reform, because what we have now is too inefficient to actually meet the goals that we have for the system. So, like Bob's report, the FAA MAC has endorsed the idea of a governance board made up of aviation users. NAV Canada's, for example, has airlines, it has unions, it has airports, other corporate officials, and indeed they do hire the CEO of NAV Canada. It is not appointed by the President or confirmed by its Senate. Secondly, we also think that this new board should set the system of fees that would underlie air traffic control use. Today, I mean, if you look at the collection of taxes, and this is where A4A is certainly right, it's a crazy quilt of taxes and fees that support the FAA. And in fact, that system itself is collapsing too, with some different trends that are occurring in airline ticketing and GA use and fuel and lots of other things. The third point I would add actually to your list, Bob, and commend it to you because I think there's some interesting twists here, is we do need a process of what public law people call codification of FAA authorities and laws. One reason we have too much oversight, Bob, is we have too many laws. And too many laws beget too many regulations, which beget too many FAA policies, which beget an incredibly large controller's handbook. And so all these overseers have too much stuff to look at because we've made the system too complex. And so as we turn over the organization of the FAA to a new model, we also need to go through and excise probably a good half, 60% of the laws that are in there, because what happens over time is Congress and the FAA keep stacking new requirements on top of each other. And they don't go back and sort of look at the old laws and old requirements that are in there and sort of eliminate those. Just one example from the airport context is, airports have Part 139, which is a compliance and enforcement regime that looks at the airport operator and has inspections and lots of other things. It's very compliance and enforcement oriented. At the same time, the FAA now wants airport operators to put in safety management systems, which is a risk management data-driven system. But rather than replacing parts of 139, they're just putting that on top of it with a new program office, new requirements on airports, and now you have to go through two, in a sense, safety programs, rather than an integrated one. So that's the kind of thing that's all over the place. If you go through any of the recent past FAA reauthorization bills, you'll see this as you read page 457, sub-bullet 5, of some new law or requirement that's put on the FAA. A couple specific suggestions for additional research, Bob, that I think if you do like you've done this one would be great. Number one is, I think we have to carefully define the new requirements of this air traffic control corporation you would like to create. And I think we need to make the point to many out there, including our general aviation friends, that the requirements really are all about services. We do have a unique aviation system. We have cross-subsidized for many years, smaller airports and rural transportation. That's something appropriate. I mean, we did that with energy back with the TVA and other things. And those are ends that we want. So we should specify the ends that we want from the system. What we shouldn't do is specialize, cite the facilities we need to actually implement those services. And I think because if you start telling people, well, are they going to keep all the towers open? Or are they going to keep all the TRACONs open? You would have defeated part of the goal, as Craig said, of making the system more efficient. Instead, we should emphasize the set of services that this new entity will provide to users out there. And obviously, you'll have a board now who will be able to look at that and check that and make sure they have that right. The second thing is, and I think about this from Craig's example with Seattle, and greener skies and implementing a lot of new procedures there. As this new entity does that, what are going to be the business case decisions that they make when they take Seattle and import it into other airports and other control towers? And what is the FAA's regulatory oversight responsibility going to be there? Because in the name of safety sometimes we can be very inefficient. And so what we have to think about is, where do we draw the line between business decisions of the new air traffic entity and things that require oversight? And again, fortunately, I think through some of the previous studies and through Bob's work, we can go to NAV Canada and see how they delineate that relationship. And I think it's going to be very important to tell that story so that we get that right and we don't burden the new entity with excessive oversight, but the right level of oversight from the DOT. And Transport Canada and NAV Canada have found a balance there. Let's determine if that's sort of the right one. And finally, I think you spent about 2 or 3 good pages in the latter part of the report talking about the transition over a 2-year period and how you would do the funding, the fees, the taxes. I think we need to spend a lot more time on that piece, because that ultimately is going to be what, together with talking about what services this new entity will provide, this is going to give comfort to the airlines, to the general aviation community, to the airports, to the other users and industries that are involved in the system. How do we map this process out over a multi-year period? And I think that would be very helpful. Finally, I think the link, one thing I think that comes from this study that we also on the MAC have thought, you cannot reform air traffic control individually without reforming the entirety of aviation policy. And the reason is that today's funding model is interwoven across all the things that we do in aviation today. So if you pull out one piece and you say, for example, today's trust fund taxes, if you take them separately, they about encompass the exact amount of money it takes the FAA today to operate and invest in the system. And then your first question is going to go, well, how do we fund safety? How do we fund certification? How do we fund regulation? How do we fund smaller airports and GA towers and smaller communities? So you have to be able to answer all those questions at the same time, Otherwise, people are going to see this reform as an effort that might threaten what they like out of the system. So we have to sort of, in a sense, even though it makes it more challenging, we have to tell the whole story, and we have to have a reform that works across the board. And really, I think this is about two big principles. We need to shift to a paradigm where, first, we operate on the basis of cost recovery for those parts of our system that can be commercialized, that don't require public subsidy. And there's actually quite a few of them. In addition to the provision of air traffic control, the larger airports in the country, all of them tomorrow could privatize. I mean, honestly. And so their needs of a cross-subsidized federal capital grant are just not really there. So if we do this right and we give them more power to recover the revenues they need to invest in terminals, runways, parking lots, whatever, that would be useful. I've also talked to the manufacturers about certification, and many of them are very open to moving to a fee-for-service system like they operate with EASA in Europe, where today, rather than Boeing getting free services on certification that are delayed and are threatened during time of sequestration, today it'll look much more like, tomorrow maybe it'll look much more like the Patent and Trademark Office, where you actually pay for that service, but in return, you get much faster and better service out of the entity. In a sense, what you're doing is exchanging savings on indirect costs for direct costs. And that's a calculus I think most people get. And so secondly and finally, after we do all of that, what's very interesting is it doesn't actually require a lot more public resources to fund the rest of the system that can't recover its costs. You know, whether that is the safety program, whether that's regulation, whether that's subsidies to small airports. By doing all that first, we've actually created a much smaller problem that we then have to address. And so if we put all these things together, I think we actually can get this thing done, and I look forward to the conversation about how we're going to do it.
Thank you very much. We're now going to have a period of 45 minutes for discussion, and I'm going to begin by asking if Bob would like to respond to our two commenters, and then see if Craig wants to respond to some of the things that Steve said. Bob, you go first.
Okay, I don't have a whole lot to say except that I really appreciate the comments from both Craig and Steve. I think, Steve, in particular, your suggestions for what else needs to be worked on are very much very timely and very much to the point, and I agree. My work has focused almost exclusively on just reforming the air traffic entity, but you have to realize that all these other things have to be looked at and moved on as part of that process. So it certainly gives me some suggestions for other things that I, contracting with people more knowledgeable than myself, can try to have Reason Foundation get into. But also, I mean, there's a lot of other entities out there that maybe if we can raise the topics as ones that need a lot of attention, maybe it will stimulate a lot of additional discussion and research that would help move the ball forward. I'm very pleased over the last year to see what you and the Management Advisory Council at FAA have been able to do, and I think does not seem to me to be very widely known. I've tried to publicize it in my newsletter. I think those findings ought to be raised to a higher level of public visibility. Maybe through things like now that you're off the body, maybe through an op-ed in the New York Times or Washington Post, something like that, to get people to understand that a broader community of thinking people, not just think tanks, have concluded that the system is so broken that it needs fundamental restructure, repair, and replacement. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Very fun, Craig.
Well, I'm not sure you're going to get the crossfire that we're hoping to. I certainly, but I do want to emphasize a couple of points that Steve made, because I do think that it's terribly important to recognize how interconnected all of these issues are. I sometimes worried that in the short term, when you're involved in an organization that's at least in large part an advocacy organization, that you're advocating for what's in the best interest of your members, and it's somehow perceived to perhaps not be in the best interest of somebody else. And I think that one of the things, when we talk about this being a moment of time, a moment of opportunity, is that within the aviation community, airlines and private aircraft, business aircraft, manufacturers have really come together around issues where sometimes an issue might be more important to one organization than another, but we came to realize that all of these impacted the strength of the community. Now, sometimes it's easier to get there when you've got an economy that's kind of put an industry in the tank, so to speak, and you're really working on survival. But my hope would be that as we come out of that, is that even another reason to say that we should look at these means of providing funding to airports, look at innovative ways to get to certification. There was a presentation with the aeronautics organization a couple of years ago where somebody held up an iPad and said, you know, this has only been out in the marketplace now for 2 years. So it's about third version. At the same time that Apple introduced the iPad, 3 major pieces of avionics equipment were taken to the FAA certification. When this guy held up the iPad on its third version, those pieces of avionics equipment were still 2 years away from certification, according to their association. That sounds critical, but it's unfortunately the pace at which the bureaucracy will run. And so there needs to be new techniques tried to reduce those costs. We don't have a representative up here, but so I want to add that I think it's also vital that we recognize we cannot get through this process without a strong airline community industry. They're calling for national policy. They have found various means to make themselves profitable. They need to be profitable. We need to have them strong. And they have a very important stake in this discussion, and I know you've interacted with them. But I think they have definitely come to the table as well as having control. I do think we will not get through this if this community gets, in the largest sense, gets pulled apart. We need to do the things
Before we open things up, I have one question I'd like to put to Bob and perhaps the others. We have heard about the deficiencies of the current system in the United States compared to those in Canada, Europe, down south in Australia, and we've also heard that the political dynamics for reform in the United States seem to be changing. I'm interested in whether the introduction of new technologies abroad is providing any competitive dynamic that could aid the cause of reconstituting funding and kind of getting around at last to catching up. It used to be that the American air traffic system was the model of the world. Now, other people are setting the standards, and we're going to have to follow. I talked to a couple of pilots that fly across the Atlantic, and they say that when they're in the United States and when they're going across the Atlantic, they're like a picture in the cockpit from a 1940s or 50s movie where the pilot's flipping around between frequencies to try to find the right frequency to talk to the ground. And then as soon as they hit Shannon, they're texting, which for routine communications is just vastly superior. And so they just can't wait to get there. And so are we slowing down innovation abroad because we're such a big part of the global system? Or is this going to offer something? You could, when you're testifying on this before Congress, you can invoke examples where we're falling behind and we've got to catch up. But are there actually going to become needs for us to do things simply because they're being done that way at a higher level of art elsewhere?
Air traffic management is a global field. I mean, it has to be compatible worldwide, and so for the United States to lag behind on things like texting and so forth really puts our airlines at a disadvantage. It puts the United States at a disadvantage, and it also potentially says that the markets for the new technology for U.S. companies is brighter overseas, where more of these things are being adopted faster than it is here at home. Which probably, there's good avionics companies in Europe, and they are out there competing on a global scale. And the more they have good technology in use in systems, the easier it is for them to sell the next AMSP on buying it. So, I mean, there's competitive threat to very good U.S. companies, I think, if we don't have more of a home market for the things, and if we end up either lagging so far behind or having to, I mean, I'm certainly not a protectionist, but I think it would be a shame if the great companies that we have here aren't able to showcase the technology advances with broad adoption in the near term rather than many, many years from now, which looks like what would happen with the status quo.
I would add, and I think it's an important question, the U.S. market is still by far the largest, but the growth is occurring in Asia. And in Asia, they're not stuck with legacy systems. Now, to some extent, that's helped American manufacturers who can go there with navigational equipment. But they are going to, as they build airports by the week in China, they are going to need an infrastructure they're going to just simply start anew. And that's going to escalate the pace at which this goes. Again, not because they'll become larger than we are right away, but because this new technology will have a place, there'll be a place for innovation, and that will occur. In Europe, before we get too carried away with ourselves, they spend about twice as much money to handle as much traffic throughout Europe as we do in the U.S. So it's not necessarily the paradigm of efficiency yet, but also they have all these different.
So many survivors and so many.
But they're working through that. Bob and I have had this conversation, and it's not a disagreement, it's really a conversation, which is, I favor looking at these different models, and especially Canada, to learn what's there. But I honestly think that we need to be careful not to say, well, we embrace that model, that's what we're going to do here. We need the American version of this.
Absolutely. It's got to be tailored to what.
And if we get that right, then I think it provides, that's the reason I spent some of my time on the private aircraft side, just as we've provided a market for incredible innovation in what goes into cockpits, we can have a marketplace that will provide for innovation in terms of other cockpits.
That's a good point, Christopher. Let's open it up.
Okay. I'm going to call on people, and we'll have plenty of time for conversation. This gentleman in the back. Yes, sir.
Gary
If
Church.
you could please wait for the microphone and introduce yourself.
Gary Church. Gary, members up there. I've worked with Bob for a long time, and it's good to see such a good report getting such good reception. The one question, the comment I want to make is that the United States does not lack in innovation. If you would look at the work that was done on reduced vertical separation minima, United States. You look at iPad, United States. You look at the technology, and we are still the world's leader in innovation. You go over and you look at our implementation, and it is miserably flawed. So we're finding that the rest of the world, like reduced vertical separation minimum, was actually our innovation implemented by Europe, forcing us to respond and do the same. So we have been very ineffective, and I think to some degree it's based upon exactly what you're talking about, the motivations that institutions have for making those changes. It has been a situation in which FAA is a very risk-averse organization that permeates the organization from its safety role. If you talk about the budget and you look at the budget items in the FAA approved by the Congress, it is simply cash flow management. If you believe that the FAA could be a pseudo business and evaluate returns on investment and net present values, you've missed that boat, and they're misleading you. So if we look, it is the organizational structure within the FAA that you're addressing right now that is flawing our progress. And if we're going to make any progress into the future, and if we're going to stay competitive on the world market, we're going to have to make that change. Thank you.
I just want to point out, one of the many peer reviewers, knowledgeable peer reviewers, one of the comments that I think I actually put in the paper without attribution, said that the organizational structure at FAA empowers numerous people who could say no to something. And it's very, very hard to find anybody that can get a definitive yes.
I'm Charlie Leoka. I run a group called the Consumer Travel Alliance. Soon we'll have a new name called Travelers United. But for the past 3 years, I've been really interested in the air traffic control next-gen debates. And I met with Nick Callio from A4A when he first came in. Hank Klokowski worked with me when he was still here. Dan Elwell over with AIA, who's now moved over to A4A. We had proposed putting together a consumer-facing PR campaign. And I suggested this because when I go to Congress and I talk about air traffic control systems, they go, oh yeah, we've got old technology. The next sentence, their eyes glaze over. I mean, they just, and they don't have the little sound bites that we need to tell people what's happening. By my calculations, we've got 623 days for the next FAA reauthorization. I mean, all of these ideas are nice, and building a new system and so on, but we've got a real problem. The problem now is in 2 years, less than 2 years, we have to find some way to influence Congress so we don't go through 22 or 23 reauthorizations. And one of the things that I'm now beginning to do again is to go back out to everybody to see if we can put together some sort of a unified PR campaign. The concept of visuals and popular mechanics, Science Illustrated. Like when I was a kid, when we saw the space project going on, everybody had these wonderful visuals and ideas. Just imagine pilot awareness, the difference between what we have today and what comes under next gen, and so on. Cartoons driven right down to the local weekly newspapers. No one's done this. We've got too many people pulling in different areas. And everybody says it's a good idea. But at the last RTCA conference, everybody said we need to get more public awareness. So I'm just saying, I'm getting ready to move on that, and I really look forward to meeting with each of you. And I don't know if there are any staffers here from Congress. Are there? See, that's really a shame, because this is where we need to educate people, at the staff level, so they can educate their bosses about what's going on. And I really, really am happy, that I came here and I get a chance to meet you guys. And because we're just beginning this outreach, and I think that it's something that there's another part to this besides the technical part, and it's the part of basically PR, right? Pushing it down to the weekly level to the normal person, and thereby reaching the Congress and the people who are going to be putting it.
I just want to say, I'm sure that Craig will agree with this, as an old Washington hand, with the political stars coming into alignment, what you described is what has to happen next. There needs to be a broad-based group. Consumers, producers, and unions and academics to push this, and you've given us the time frame. Let me mention that Bob is, as soon as we're through, he's going to be going up and doing a reprise of this presentation on the Hill, so we're working on that side too.
And I only wanted to add, what you're talking about is absolutely critical, and the good news is that there are now many, many more real examples that you can draw from that people can understand, where there is benefit for the traveler, for the business that needs to ship equipment, that sort of thing. So we all will connect with you.
I think it's also significant that all three major business organizations, NAM, Business Roundtable, and the U.S. Chamber, see this as an important issue and potentially could spend money on it as the thing gets rolling.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I'm a little slow on the draw, but I'm a congressional staffer with the House Science Committee. So, of course, we're always happy to speak to folks, to hear from you all. So, if you'd like to, we can exchange information after. But, sorry, just a little slow.
Great.
Thank you very much. It's the House Aviation.
You're going to be surrounded as soon as we break up.
Aviation Subcommittee.
The space subcommittee.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying, today's briefing is for the aviation subcommittee, but certainly be happy to brief yours too.
The next two questions will be here, and then Mr. Shirley.
Mine isn't really a question, but to your point, the U.S. Travel and Tourism Association has also embraced that we need to do something about air traffic control. I think, Steve, were you speaking at that one or sometime? So there are a next big, the hotels and travel tourism industry recognizing that they need a better air traffic control system. So it seems like we're getting a group. The second comment I would make, and it's not really a question, but I know some of us have to be thinking, and I'm Shirley Wybear, I work for the Reason Foundation, I work with Bob. But the next thing is, or one of the things is we go to the Hill or get all of these groups going, the transition and how that's positioned and how much needs to be written in legislation is going to be a real challenge. And I'm someone who worked on getting national dollars out of the federal government. We can be too prescriptive. We can be maybe not enough to make other people comfortable. And it's just a comment because I know Chris was in the administration then, Craig was in the administration then. So that's sort of if we can get the momentum, that's sort of the next thing I keep not worrying about and thinking about.
Okay, well, the microphone's getting passed, so take it to the next person, but I'm also impressed that so many of the issues with regard to aviation today are really addressed on a bunch of bipartisan basis. Ranking members, committee chairs, leaders in both houses of different parties, they don't come at this with a strong partisan leaning. And I think that makes a big difference in terms of trying to put a coalition together.
I agree with you.
Yeah, my name's Dre Selwick. I've been retired for many years. I used to be director of research at FAA, and I guess back in the 80s, we worked extensively with European air navigation service providers on doing research together. Each one of them had extensive research programs, and they really were necessary so you would learn how to use the technology we talked about adopting. What I've seen, though, is since they've moved away from being, national entities or whatever you want to call them, the research has died out in those organizations. In Europe, the research is really being pushed by the European Commission and by Eurocontrol. And I'm curious what you think ought to be done in the U.S., both to have the government-funded research done and also what kind of policies you might want to have to get the industry to get more heavily engaged in doing research.
Well, that's a good question, Grace, and I have not really given that much thought. The research that I see coming out of FAA, some of it seems promising. The problem has been the follow-through of actually translating that into an action, effective change. So certainly the research is also good. I mean, NASA did some of the foundational work for NextGen. I don't think they're doing much of that any longer, which is unfortunate because that there's only so many research dollars, and how they get spent determines what gets researched. I don't know. Has the MAC addressed that at all?
No, I think it's an actual very interesting needs assessment that I think we have to figure out as part of this. I mean, the model that TRB has with some of the cooperative programs, particularly the airport cooperative program, and the fact that's funded out of the trust fund and provides some stability there, is sort of an interesting model. One would wonder,
Yes.
Would you carry that over in some different way?
Well, that's an interesting point. It's only the airport cooperative. It's not the aviation.
That's true.
So it excludes, by definition, it excludes air traffic control, which is unfortunate. And that may be one avenue that we can probably take.
I think it is. It's a very important point, and it's worth noting, I think, just because she's here, that Margaret Jenney and RTCA are spending more time internationally probably than ever before. And on the NAC, as opposed to the MAC, the Next Gen Advisory Council, we've had participation from the Europeans. I think when 5-6 years ago, there was like a competition. Okay, who's going to get there first? It's much more, how do we build this together now, and
Because as you get closer to implementing, it's got to be as much coordinated as
so
possible.
I think there's a growing awareness. And I know some of us advocated for the FAA that they get more engaged, internationally, more engaged in the price of a good person to run the airports. They good for Europe, which is good for Europe. But I think I think that people are trying to respond to that. So even though certainly Europe's organization, but they have
Could be under the new model that that research could be something that would be retained, not necessarily at the FAA, but might be retained in the government, in Steve's division of what goes out and what stays. There's been a lot of pertinent research done at DOT, other places, Energy Department around the government, and to the extent that a commercialized entity based on experience abroad is going to underinvest, it sounds to me like a pretty good public function. We have several hands over here. These two gentlemen on the aisle, and then we'll move inward.
Hi, thank you. Greg Principato, former president of Airports Council International North America. Bob, in terms of your comment about ACRP, there are the 5 next-gen projects in this new round of RFPs that just went out.
That's good to know. I didn't
That
realize
is,
that.
that is a good thing. Maybe a comment and then or an observation and a question, I suppose. These ideas have been around for a long time. As Bob and I first met when I was working on the Belials Commission, I was the executive director, and your remedies page looks like a summary of the Belials Commission. So 20 years ago, I think we wanted satellite-based navigation by 1997 or something like that. See how that worked out. But I think the comment that several of you have made is correct, that a big thing that's changed is people in the community are coming together over these things. I think that's, in concept, I think that's important. I think the point that Steve made is really critical to keep in mind in all this, which is that we're not going to solve this without taking the whole picture into account, because it's all so interwoven. And that's where you sort of get, national airline policy, national aviation policy, all that kind of stuff. Craig may remember a year and a half or so ago in my ACI role, I tried to get all the association heads together to talk about an aviation policy. And it was slow going from a couple of the associations, and then one email that was sent to me in error, I'm sure, from the head of one of them indicated that there was no interest from that. I won't name the organization, but there was no interest in going that way. And as long as we leave it to the industry or even academics or anybody like that, we're going to have these great discussions and all the rest of it. But I can tell you, absent anything else, the airlines just want those taxes and fees reduced. That's their main goal. No matter what, I talk about being liberated and being able to say what you want.
We get in all kinds of trouble now.
Right, absolutely, Craig. This is great, isn't it? Most airport directors, I'd say all of them pretty much, given the current system is the one we have, they just want another couple bucks on the PFC. That would be fine, they'd take that and go home. Like change, I suppose, in some level, but a couple bucks, go home, that'd be fine. Where's the leadership going to come from? And we talked, you all touched on this a little bit. I remember 1978 airline deregulation, nobody wanted it. The airlines least of all, no one wanted it. But you all remember Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, John Robson, Fred Kahn, Ted Kennedy, Steve Breyer, these people stepped up to it, from the Hill and from the two different administrations, and did something about it. And how do we get there? It goes back to what Charlie said as well. And all these things are great, but because of the really important point I think Steve made about we're not going to solve the issue we're talking about today, that Bob and I have talked about for 20 years, without getting our arms around the whole thing. And I'm still not convinced that the industry actors left to their own devices are going to get there. We need some kind of, whether it's from an administration or who it is.
Well, I think political champions, both in the administration and in Congress, on a bipartisan basis in Congress, it's critically important, and we're working on that, certainly, a number of us are. But I also think, looking at some of the different associations, there's more going on than appears in public statements. There's been a lot of discussion